A forgotten rancher saved an Apache girl from wolves. 15 years later, she returned as chief of the tribe. The horsemen emerged at first light, but they weren't arriving to demand payments. Dalton Keene observed through his splintered pane as 5 Apache warriors neared his crumbling spread, advancing with the exactness of a battle group, though bearing no arms. The front rider swung down and set a tiny, time-worn item on his gatepost, a thing that caused Dalton's roughened fingers to shake. It was a youngster's hide wristband, ripped and marked with aged gore. Dalton hadn't laid eyes on that wristband in 15 years. He'd erased it from his memory entirely. But someone else had held on to it through the years, safeguarded it, treasured it. The Apache woman, who now stepped forward, moved like water, like smoke, like something that could disappear if he blinked too hard. Her eyes held secrets that could burn down empires. "You don't remember me," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who commanded thousands. "But I remember the wolves." Dalton's breath caught. The wolves. The night everything changed. The night he thought no one would ever know about. She stepped closer, and in the morning light, he could see the 3 small scars on her left wrist. Scars he had bandaged with strips from his own shirt while a child bled in his arms. But this woman wasn't a child anymore. This was someone who could make the earth itself obey. "My name is Ayanna," she said, and the way she spoke made it sound like Averdict. "I am chief of the Redstone Apache, and I have come to settle a debt that has been waiting 15 years to be paid." But the debt she spoke of wasn't what Dalton expected, and what she was about to offer him would change everything he thought he knew about: justice, memory, and the price of being forgotten. The leather bracelet felt heavier than it should have. Dalton turned it over in his callous hands, studying the intricate beadwork that someone had painstakingly repaired over the years. He could still smell the smoke from that night 15 years ago, still hear the desperate howling that had drawn him away from his warm cabin into the frozen wilderness. "You were bleeding so much," he said quietly, his voice cracking like old timber. "You thought you were going to die in my arms." Ayanna stood perfectly still, her dark eyes never leaving his face. The 4 warriors behind her remained mounted, silent as carved stone. But Dalton could feel their attention like heat from a forge. These weren't ordinary riders. They moved with the discipline of men who had seen war, who'd survived when others hadn't. "I was years old," Ayanna said. "My father had taken me to gather winter herbs near Theriver. We didn't know the wolves had been driven down from the mountains by the early freeze." Her voice carried no emotion, but her fingers unconsciously traced the scars on her wrist. 3 of them cornered me against the rocks. My father was too far away. He could hear me screams, but he couldn't reach me. Dalton remembered the sound of snapping jaws, the way the largest wolf had lunged for the child's throat. He had fired twice, maybe 3 times. The details blurred together like smoke, but he remembered the weight of the girl Ash carried her back to his cabin, remembered how her blood had soaked through his shirt. "You never came back for the bracelet," he said. "My father forbade it. He said, owing a debt to a white man would bring shame to our family." Ayanna's jaw tightened. But a chief doesn't answer to anyone, not even the memory of a father. Something cold settled in Dalton's stomach. Chief, the word carried weight out here, carried power that could reshape the entire territory. An Apache chief commanding, this many warriors could negotiate with, governors could sign treaties that affected thousands of lives. Why now, Hesked? Why after all these years? Ayanna glanced toward his sagging fence, his failing crops, the roof that leaked in 3 places. Her eyes took in every detail of his poverty, every sign of his isolation. When she looked back at him, something dangerous flickered in her expression. "Because I heard what they're planning to do to you, Dalton Keene, and I won't allow it." But before she could explain what she meant, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the valley. Dalton turned toward the main road and felt his blood turn to ice. 5 riders were coming fast, and Hare cognized the lead horse. It was Marshal Voss, and he wasn't coming alone. Marshal Voss rode like a man carrying bad news, his badge catching the morning sun as he approached. The 4 men behind him weren't lawmen. Dalton recognized them immediately: Clayton Banks from the land office, Silas Ward, who held the deed to half the county, and 2 hired men whose job was to make sure difficult conversations stayed polite. "Keen," Voss called out, reining in his horse 20 FT away. High's eyes swept over the Apache riders with obvious unease. "Didn't expect to find you entertaining guests." Dalton stepped forward, positioning himself between them, Arshel and Ayanna. "What do you want, Voss?" "Same thing I wanted last week and the week before that." Voss dismounted slowly, his hand resting casually on his holster. "Mr. Ward here has been patient, but patients don't pay interest on loans." Silas Ward urged his horse forward, a thin man with predator's eyes. "Months overdue, Keen. 3 months of excuses and empty promises." He pulled a folded document from his coat. This, the Apache woman, who now stepped forward, moved like water, like smoke, like something that could disappear if he blinked too hard. Her eyes held secrets that could burn down empires. "You don't remember me," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who commanded thousands. "But I remember the wolves." Dalton's breath caught. The wolves. The night everything changed. The night he thought no one would ever know about. She stepped closer, and in the morning light, he could see the 3 small scars on her left wrist. Scars he had bandaged with strips from his own shirt while a child bled in his arms. But this woman wasn't a child anymore. This was someone who could make the earth itself obey. "My name is Ayanna," she said, and the way she spoke made it sound like Averdict. "I am chief of the Redstone Apache, and I have come to settle a debt that has been waiting 15 years to be paid." But the debt she spoke of wasn't what Dalton expected, and what she was about to offer him would change everything he thought he knew about justice, memory, and the price of being forgotten. The leather bracelet felt heavier than it should have. Dalton turned it over in his callous hands, studying the intricate beadwork that someone had painstakingly repaired over the years. He could still smell the smoke from that night 15 years ago, still hear the desperate howling that had drawn him away from his warm cabin into the frozen wilderness. "You were bleeding so much," he said quietly, his voice cracking like old timber. "You thought you were going to die in my arms." Ayanna stood perfectly still, her dark eyes never leaving his face. The 4 warriors behind her remained mounted, silent as carved stone. But Dalton could feel their attention like heat from a forge. These weren't ordinary riders. They moved with the discipline of men who had seen war, who'd survived when others hadn't. "I was 8 years old," Ayanna said. "My father had taken me to gather winter herbs near Theriver. We didn't know the wolves had been driven down from the mountains by the early freeze." Her voice carried no emotion, but her fingers unconsciously traced the scars on her wrist. 3 of them cornered me against the rocks. My father was too far away. He could hear me screams, but he couldn't reach me. Dalton remembered the sound of snapping jaws, the way the largest wolf had lunged for the child's throat. He had fired twice, maybe 3 times. The details blurred together like smoke, but he remembered the weight of the girl Ash carried her back to his cabin, remembered how her blood had soaked through his shirt. "You never came back for the bracelet," he said. "My father forbade it," he said. "Owing a debt to a white man would bring shame to our family." Ayanna's jaw tightened. But a chief doesn't answer to anyone, not even the memory of a father. Something cold settled in Dalton's stomach. Chief, the word carried weight out here, carried power that could reshape the entire territory. An Apache chief commanding, this many warriors could negotiate with, governors could sign treaties that affected thousands of lives. Why now, Hesked? Why after all these years? Ayanna glanced toward his sagging fence, his failing crops, the roof that leaked in 3 places. Her eyes took in every detail of his poverty, every sign of his isolation. When she looked back at him, something dangerous flickered in her expression. "Because I heard what they're planning to do to you, Dalton Keene, and I won't allow it." But before she could explain what she meant, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the valley. Dalton turned toward the main road and felt his blood turn to ice. 5 riders were coming fast, and Hare cognized the lead horse. It was Marshal Voss, and he wasn't coming alone. Marshal Voss rode like a man carrying bad news, his badge catching the morning sun as he approached. The 4 men behind him weren't lawmen. Dalton recognized them immediately. Clayton Banks from the land office, Silas Ward, who held the deed to half the county, and 2 hired men whose job was to make sure difficult conversations stayed polite. "Keen!" Voss called out, reining in his horse 20 ft away. High Size swept over the Apache riders with obvious unease. "Didn't expect to find you entertaining guests." Dalton stepped forward, positioning himself between them, Arshel and Ayanna. "What do you want, Voss?" "Same thing I wanted last week and the week before that." Voss dismounted slowly, his hand resting casually on his holster. "Mr. Ward here has been patient, but patients don't pay interest on loans." Silas Ward urged his horse forward, a thin man with predator's eyes. Months overdue, Keen. 3 months of excuses and empty promises. He pulled a folded document from his coat. "This here's a writ of seizure. Everything you own becomes property of Ward Holdings as of today." The words hit Dalton like physical blows. 3 months. It felt like 3 years since the drought had killed his cattle, since the bank had called in his loans, since his neighbors had started crossing the street to avoid him. A man could fall far in this territory, but he could fall faster than most. "Give me another week," Dalton said, hating how desperate he sounded. "I've got prospects. A buyer coming from." "No more weeks," Ward interrupted. "No more prospects. You're done, Keen. Pack what you can carry and get off my land." Ayanna moved then, just a single step forward, but the effect was electric. The Apache warriors behind her shifted almost imperceptibly, and suddenly the morning felt charged with tension. Marshal Voss's hand dropped to his gun rip. "Gentlemen," Ayanna said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding." Ward's face went pale. "This is a private matter between white men. Woman Apache business don't concern." "My business," Ayanna said quietly, "is whatever I decide it is." She walked to her horse and withdrew a leather pouch heavy with the metallic sound of coins. When she turned back to Ward, her expression could have carved stone. "How much does he owe?" Ward licked his lips nervously. $800 plus interest. But that don't change nothing. "The contract's been breached. The land is forfeit." Ayanna opened the pouch and counted out gold pieces, each one gleaming in the sun. Real gold, not paper money or promises. The kind of wealth that could buy silence, loyalty, or a man's entire future. But when she finished counting, Dalton realized the gold wasn't meant for Ward at all. It was meant for something else entirely, something that would change everything. Ayanna walked to Dalton's broken fence and drove a wooden stake into the ground with decisive strikes. Then she tied a strip of red cloth to the post, the fabric snapping in the wind like a battle flag. "This land is now under the protection of the Redstone Apache," she announced, her voice carrying across the valley. "Any man who trespasses here answers to me." Ward sputtered, his face turning crimson. "You can't just claim white man's land." "There are laws, treaties." "The Treaty of Broken Hills," Ayanna said calmly. Article 7, Section 3. Apache tribes retain the right to grant sanctuary to any person who has provided aid to tribal members. She pulled a rolled document from her saddlebag, official seals gleaming. "I have the authority to extend tribal protection to this property and its owner." Marshal Voss examined the document with shaking hands. Dalton could see the man's face go pale as he read. Treaties weren't suggestions out here. They were binding law backed by federal authority. Breaking one could bring down the territorial governor himself. "This is nonsense," Ward snapped. "What aid? When did this man ever help your people?" Ayanna untied a leather cord from around her neck, revealing a small carved wolf tooth. 15 years ago, Dalton Keen saved my life. He fought 3 wolves with nothing but his bare hands and an old rifle. He carried me 7 miles through a blizzard to tend my wounds." She held up her scarred wrist. "These marks are my proof." "A child's story." Ward scoffed. "You expect us to believe?" "I expect you to believe federal law." Ayanna cut him off. She mounted her horse in one fluid motion. "Mr. Keen's dead is hereby assumed by the Redstone Apache. We will settle accounts with you in our own time, in our own way." Ward's confidence cracked. Dealing with a broke rancher was one thing. Dealing with an Apache tribe that controlled trade routes and had the ear of territorial officials was entirely different. "You can't just ride in here and change everything," he said. But his voice lacked conviction. Ayanna studied him with the patience of a predator. "Mr. Ward, my people have been trading with settlements across this territory for generations. We know which merchants honor their agreements and which ones prey on desperate men. Her smile was sharp as winter wind. Perhaps it's time other business owners knew as well. The threat was subtle but devastating. Ward's empire depended on reputation, on the trust of other ranchers and merchants. One word from an Apache chief could destroy years of carefully built relationships. "This isn't over," Ward muttered, yanking his horse around. "No," Ayanna agreed. "It isn't." As the men rode away, Dalton felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. Everything he thought he knew about his life, his failures, his place in this harsh world, was changing. But Ayanna wasn't finished. She dismounted and walked to his cabin door, her expression suddenly vulnerable. "There's something else, Dalton. Something I never told anyone." She touched the wolf-tooth-off pendant. "The night you saved me, you weren't alone in those woods." Dalton's hand froze on the cabin door. "What do you mean, not alone?" Ayanna's warriors dismounted and began making camp near the creek, their movements efficient and purposeful. They would stay, Dalton realized. This wasn't a brief visit or symbolic gesture. This was protection, real and immediate. "My brother was with me that night," Ayanna said quietly. "Takakota. He was 10 years old, slow in the mind but quick to laugh. The wolves got him first." The words hit Dalton like a physical blow. He sank onto his porch steps, memories flooding back. There had been 2 children. How had he forgotten? The boy had been already dead when Dalton arrived, his small body torn apart in the snow. Dalton had focused on the girl, on saving who could still be saved. "I tried to pull him away from them," Ayanna continued, her voice steady but hollow. "That's when they turned on me. By the time you arrived, Dakota was beyond help." "I'm sorry," Dalton whispered. "I should have been faster. Should have." "You saved one child that night when you could have walked away." Ayanna sat beside him on the steps. Most men would have avoided the sound of screaming, would have decided it wasn't their problem. Dalton studied her face, seeing past the authority and power to the 8-year-old girl who had watched her brother die. "How did you become chief? Your father said owing me a debt would bring shame. My father died of fever 3 winters after that night. The shame he spoke of died with him." Ayanna's voice hardened. "I spent years learning the laws of both our peoples. Treaties, trading rights, territorial boundaries. Knowledge became my weapon." She stood and walked to where her warriors had built a small fire. "When the old chief died without sons, the council debated for months. They said a woman couldn't lead, couldn't negotiate with white officials." Her laugh was bitter. "So I wrote a loan to the territorial capital and negotiated a trade agreement that brought more wealth to our people than any chief in memory." Dalton watched her move among the warriors, saw how they looked at her with respect earned through action, not inheritance. "And now you're here." "Now I'm here," she agreed. "Because 15 years ago, a forgotten rancher taught me that honor isn't about blood or tradition. It's about choices made when no one is watching." One of the warriors approached and spoke quietly in Apache. Ayanna's expression darkened as she listened. When the man finished, she turned back to Dalton. "Ward didn't go home," she said. "He rode toward town, toward the telegraph office. He's calling in favors, probably contacting the territorial marshal." Dalton felt cold dread settle in his stomach. Territorial marshals had authority over local law, over treaties, over everything. If Ward could convince them that Ayanna was overstepping her bounds, "How long do we have?" he asked. Ayanna looked toward the horizon where dust clouds marked Ward's passage. "Maybe 2 days, maybe less." She met his eyes, and for the first time since her arrival, Hess saw uncertainty there. "But there's one more thing Ward doesn't know. One thing that could change everything." Ayanna walked to her saddlebags and withdrew air-rolled map, its edges worn from years of handling. She spread it on Dalton's porch, weighing down the corners with stones. "Your land sits on the old winter trail," she said, tracing a path with her finger. "For 300 years, my people used this route to reach the sacred burial grounds in the northern mountains. Ward knows this." Dalton studied the map, seeing his property marked in precise detail. So he's not after your ranch for the debt money." Ayanna's voice carried the weight of accumulated knowledge. "The territorial government is planning a railroad through this valley. They need a clear path. No tribal claims, no treaty complications." The pieces began falling into place in Dalton's mind. Ward's eagerness to foreclose despite the small amount owed, the rushed timeline, the hired men who looked more like enforcers than debt collectors. "Ward thinks if he controls your land, he controls the route," Ayanna continued. "But tribal burial grounds are protected under federal law. Their railroad can't touch them without renegotiating every treaty in the territory. Unless there's no one left subject, Dalton said grimly. Exactly. Drive out the small ranchers. Buy up the land cheap. Present it to the railroad as a clean deal. Ayanna rolled up the map. Ward's been doing this across 3 counties. Your ranch is the last piece he needs. Dalton felt anger building in his chest. Not just at Ward, but at his own blindness. He'd thought his failures were personal, his isolation deserved. Instead, he'd been systematically destroyed by men who saw him as nothing more than an obstacle. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" he asked. "Because knowledge without power is just pain." Ayanna mounted her horse. "But now you have power. The protection of my tribe, the backing of federal treaties, and something Ward doesn't expect." "What's that? A witness to his crimes?" Before Dalton could ask what she meant, hoofbeats echoed from the main road. But these weren't Marshal Voss's heavy horses or Ward's nervous clattering. This was a single rider moving fast and desperate. A young Apache brave appeared over the hill, his horse ulcered with sweat. He spoke rapidly to Ayanna in their native language, his words tumbling over each other with urgency. As he talked, Ayanna's face grew darker. When the brave finished, Ayanna turned to Dalton with eyes like winter storms. "Ward didn't go to the telegraph office. She said he went to Fort Collins. He's convinced Colonel Brennan that we're in violation of territorial boundaries that were threatening white settlers." Dalton's blood turned cold. Fort Collins meant cavalry. Cavalry meant federal authority that could override any treaty, any protection Ayanna might offer. "How many soldiers?" he asked. 2 companies, 60 men, maybe 70. Ayanna's voice remained steady, but Dalton could see the calculation in her eyes. "They'll be here by tomorrow afternoon." One of her warriors stepped forward and spoke quietly. Ayanna listened, then shook her head firmly. "What did he say?" Dalton asked. "He suggested we withdraw before the cavalry arrives. Leave you to face Ward alone." Ayanna's jaw tightened. It told him that's not how debts are paid. She looked toward the horizon where dust clouds marked the approaching threat. "But we need more than 4 warriors and good intentions to face down cavalry units. What do we need?" Ayanna smiled. And for the first time since her arrival, it wasn't the careful expression of a chief managing diplomacy. It was the fierce grin of a survivor who had learned to turn disadvantage into weapon. "We need to make sure Colonel Brennan learns the truth about Ward's business before those soldiers reach your land." But as she spoke, another rider appeared on the horizon. This one wore the blue uniform of a cavalry scout, and he was riding hard toward Fort Collins with a message that would change everything. Ayanna dispatched her fastest rider toward Fort Collins, carrying a leather pouch sealed with tribal markings. "Letters from 3 territorial judges who've been investigating Ward's land purchases," she explained to Dalton. "Evidence of forged documents, intimidated witnesses, false claims to tribal territory." "You've been planning this for weeks," Dalton realized. "Months," Ayanna checked Hereful. "Movements precise and practiced. Your ranch wasn't the first Ward try to steal, but it will be the last." As the sun climbed higher, more riders appeared on the horizon. But these weren't cavalry or wardsmen. They were ranchers, settlers, townspeople, all heading toward Dalton's property with grim determination. "Who are they?" Dalton asked. One of Ayanna's warriors lowered his spyglass. "Looks like half the county. Men Ward's cheated. Families he's driven out, merchants he's destroyed," Thomas McCarty wrote in first, his face weathered by years of failed crops and broken promises. "Keen," he called out, dismounting heavily. "Heard Ward's finally coming for your land." "News travels fast," Dalton replied. "Fast enough Marty spat in the dust. That snake took my water rights 2 years ago. Claimed I owed money I never borrowed, produced papers I never signed." He looked at Ayanna with cautious respect. "Lady here sent word that we might finally get some justice." More men arrived throughout the morning. Samuel Brooks, who'd lost his grain mill towards manufactured debts. Ezra Tate, whose cattle ranch had been seized for imaginary violations. Each carried weapons. Each bore the hard expression of men who'd been pushed too far. "This isn't your fight," Dalton told them. "The hell it isn't," Brooks shot back. "Ward's been picking us off one by one, using the law like a club. But if we stand together," Ayanna surveyed the growing crowd of nearly 30 men. "Colonel Brennan will have to think twice about attacking this many citizens, especially with federal judges reviewing Ward's business practices." But even as she spoke, dust clouds appeared from multiple directions. The cavalry was coming from the north, Ward and his hired men from the east, and something else from the south. A wagon train that moved with military precision. Dalton squinted against the glare. What's that southern group? Ayanna's expression grew tense as she studied the approaching wagons, Territorial Marshal Davidson and his deputies. Ward called in every favor he had. The situation was spiraling beyond anyone's control. What had started as a simple debt collection was becoming a standoff between territorial authorities, federal law, tribal rights, and angry settlers. One wrong move could ignite violence that would echo across the entire territory. "We're outnumbered 3-1, McCarty observed grimly. "Numbers don't matter if we're in the right," Brooks replied. "Being right don't stop bullets," Tate added. Ayanna climbed onto Dalton's porch and raised her voice to address the gathered men. 15 years ago, Dalton Keene risked his life to save a child. He asked for nothing in return, expected no reward. Today, we stand on his land not just to protect one man, but to prove that honor still means something in this territory. The men listened with the intensity of soldiers receiving battle orders. Ward thinks he can steal what belongs to theirs because he has papers and hired guns. But papers can be proven false, and hired guns work for whoever pays most. She pointed toward the approaching forces. What he doesn't have is what we have, the truth and people willing duty for it. But as the various groups converged on Dalton's ranch, a new rider appeared from the west. This one carried a white flag and wore the insignia of a federal Indian agent. The final player in Ward's game had arrived, and everything was about to change one last time. The federal Indian agent rode with the authority of Washington behind him. Agent Marcus Whitmore dismounted with deliberate ceremony, his crisp uniform a stark contrast to the dust and tension surrounding Dalton's ranch. "Chief Ayanna," he said, inclining his head respectfully. "Agent Whitmore, Bureau of Indian Affairs, I've come regarding your formal complaint against Silas Ward." Ward's face went ashen as he urged his horse forward from where his group had positioned themselves near the main road. "Agent Whitmore, there's been a misunderstanding. This woman has no authority to file federal complaints regarding violations of treaty law," Whitmore interrupted. "I'm afraid she has every authority, Mr. Ward. In fact, her documentation was quite thorough. Colonel Brennan rode up with military precision, his cavalry arranged in battle formation behind him. Agent Whitmore, I received reports of Apache aggression against territorial citizens. Are we dealing with a hostile situation?" "The only hostility I see," Whitmore replied calmly, "comes from Mr. Ward's documented pattern of illegal land seizures." He withdrew a thick folder from his saddlebag. "Forged deeds, falsified debt documents, intimidation of witnesses, all in violation of federal law and Apache treaty rights." Ward's hired men shifted nervously. This wasn't what they'd signed up for. Fighting desperate ranchers was one thing. Facing federal charges was entirely different. "Those are lies," Ward sputtered. "Savage propaganda designed to careful, Mr. Ward." Ayanna's voice cut like steel. "Insults to a tribal chief in the presence of federal agents can be construed as a violation of diplomatic protocols." Colonel Brennan studied the situation with the practiced eye of a career soldier. He could see the gathered ranchers, the Apache warriors, the federal agent with official documentation. This wasn't a simple case of frontier violence anymore. "Agent Whitmore," the colonel said, "what exactly are you proposing?" "An immediate investigation into Mr. Ward's business practices, starting with the illegal seizure of tribal burial grounds for railroad development." Whitmore's words carried the weight of federal authority. Any military action against Chief Ayanna, the citizens she's protecting, would constitute interference with a federal investigation. Thomas McCarty stepped forward, his voice steady despite the rifle in his hands. "Colonel, we're nother for war. We're here because the law failed us, and this woman offered justice." "Justice?" Ward's laugh was bitter. "You call this savage intimidation justice?" Dalton had remained silent through the confrontation, but Ward's words ignited something inside him. 15 years of isolation, of believing himself worthless, of accepting blame for circumstances beyond his control. Savage. Dalton stepped forward, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "Silas, you want to talk about Savage? Let me tell you about Savage." Had pulled off his work shirt, revealing a torso crisscrossed with old scars. 15 years ago, I found two children being torn apart by wolves. One was already dead. The other was dying. I could have walked away, told myself it wasn't my problem. The crowd had gone silent. Evenward's hired man leaning forward to listen. Instead, I fought 3 wolves with my bare hands to save that little girl. Carried her 7 mi through a blizzard to tend her wounds. Never asked for thanks. Never expected reward. Dalton looked directly at Ward. That little girl grew up to become the most powerful leader in this territory. And when she heard you were trying to steal me land through lies and corruption, she came to pay her debt. Ayanna moved Toston beside Dalton, her presence transforming him from isolated rancher to a man worthy of a chief's protection. The savage in this story, Silas, isn't the woman who honored a 15-year-old debt. It's the man who built his fortune destroying honest people. But Ward wasn't finished. His hand moved toward his holster, desperation making him dangerous. I won't be lectured by a failed rancher and his savage. The gunshot echoed across the valley, and everything changed in the space between heartbeats. Marshal Voss lowered his smoking pistol, Ward's gun spinning in the dust where it had been shot from his hand. That's enough, Ward. You're under arrest for attempted assault on a federal agent. Ward clutched his bleeding wrist, his face twisted with rage and pain. You can't do this. I have contracts, legal documents. You have forged papers and a lot of explaining to do, Agent Whitmore said, motioning to his deputies. Mr. Ward, you're being charged with federal crimes related to treaty violations, document fraud, and conspiracy to defraud the territorial government. As Ward was led away in shackles, his hired men scattered like tumbleweeds in the wind. Without Ward's money behind them, they had no stomach for fighting federal agents and cavalry officers. Colonel Brennan addressed Ayanna with the respect due to a legitimate governmental authority. Chief Ayanna, I apologize for the confusion. We'll be withdrawing our forces immediately. Thank you, Colonel. Your swift response to protect territorial citizens is commendable. Ayanna's diplomatic tone carried no trace of anger, only the measured words of someone accustomed to turning potential enemies into allies. As the various officials departed, the gathered ranchers began to disperse as well. But they approached Dalton first, each man shaking his hand, offering words of respect and promises of assistance in rebuilding his ranch. Always knew you were good people, Keen Thomas McCarthy. Just took the right circumstances to prove it. When the last of them had gone, Dalton found himself alone with Ayanna and her warriors beside the creek that bordered his property. The silence felt different now. Not the oppressive isolation of a forgotten man, but the peaceful quiet of someone who belonged somewhere. Your debt is paid, Dalton said quietly. More than paid. You saved my land, my life, maybe my sanity. Ayanna shook her head. The debt was never about saving your life, Dalton. It was about recognizing what kind of man you are. She gestured toward his ranch, his repaired fence, the red cloth still flying from the post. A man who fights for others when it would be easier to walk away. She mounted her horse, but instead of preparing to leave, she pulled out a folded document. The territorial government owes my tribes significant compensation for Ward's illegal use of our burial grounds. Part of that settlement includes water rights to this entire valley. Dalton felt his heart sink. After everything, would he lose his land anyway? I'm deeding those water rights to you, Ayanna continued, along with a contract to supply horse to the Apache reservation. You'll have steady income and the respect of every rancher in the territory. The transformation was complete. The forgotten man who had saved a child from wolves now stood as a partner to the most powerful tribal leader in the region. His isolation had ended not through his own efforts, but through the long memory of someone he had helped without thought of reward. Why, hesked. You could have any rancher in the territory as a partner. Ayanna smiled, and for a moment he saw not the chief of Thairdstone Apache, but the 8-year-old girl whose life he had saved in a blizzard 15 years ago. Because honor recognized, honor Dalton Keene. And because some debts are too important to ever truly repay, they can only be honored. As she rode away with her warriors, Dalton stood in front of his cabin. No longer a broken-down shack, but the home of a man who mattered. The red cloth snapped in the wind, marking his land as protected, his future as secure. His place in the world as earned through the simplest and most difficult thing a man could do. Help another human being when no one was watching. The forgotten rancher had been forgotten no more. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where courage and destiny meet in the untamed frontier. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.